So today I want to talk about increasing leisure skills, or more specifically, leisure item engagement in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And so the reason why I chose this specific paper and topic is because a lot of my clients right now really need leisure skills, and I'm having trouble building leisure skills, especially for those that have very limited interest. So I came across this paper by Dr. Roscoe and colleagues, and I thought it was pretty cool. So let me just walk us through this study together. Before I start, do you guys have what are your experience in teaching like leisure skills to clients? Is it a skill that you think is pretty easy to teach, or do you also face some challenges like I do, especially in cases where the kids might be older when they start therapy, so they don't get a chance to be exposed to play skills when they're younger, or especially with individuals with very limited skill set or very severe problem behavior?
Yeah, I encounter that. I think with the older, like you said, with the older kids, the older individual adults, it's more difficult because, like you said, they had late intervention, one, but it's also when they're adults, it's not, we can always expose, but we can't force them. If they choose not to, then it's not something that we can, like push ahead.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes I still offer it as a choice, but most of the time they'll stick with what their interest is. So a lot of the a lot of the leisure skills that I encounter with the older children tend to be more iPad related.
Yeah,
Um, they like the ASMR. Have you seen those?
like the videos, YouTube videos.
Yeah, those ASMR. They like those. But then there's also those that like they're not age appropriate. So I've got like 21-year-old and 14-year-old, and they're still into the Thomas the Tank, Sesame Street. But it's their interest. It's not something that we can, yeah. I know that like with when they go to respite, they go out more into the community, like for walks, just outdoors. They go out and get some chips. But that's pretty much it. It's really like they don't engage in sports, or they go to the park and then some of them play with the waters, some of them just choose to sit down. But yeah, it's really hard to develop those leisure skills.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree, and that's why I looked into this paper. But we'll see more about how they increase leisure skills in this group of participants they have here. So we all know this, but teaching multiple leisure skills is very important, just to increase someone's potential access to different reinforcers and also opportunities of learning. Um, it increases their opportunity to interact with people also, and also apparently leisure skills is a prerequisite for making choices. Um, and having multiple leisure skills, I think, is also beneficial because there are events where, for example, if a kid only likes iPad and the iPad is not available on an airplane, then we'll be in trouble because then the individual does not know how to um, keep themselves busy. So it is still, I think, one of our tasks to be able to teach them other leisure skills to engage in. Um, so in this study, before they chose participants, they first determined whether the individual participating in the study actually show limited leisure item engagement. So to check if an individual has limited leisure item engagement, there is a preference assessment called response restriction preference assessment. So this preference assessment essentially presents multiple leisure items to individuals, and we just record the duration of engagement with each item. And if one item out of the array we see high engagement, we restrict that the access to that item, and then we represent the remaining items. And if the individual does not show interest to the remaining items, then that just shows that they do have limited interest. That's like the summary of that assessment. And this assessment has been used not only in this study to determine if the participants are eligible or not, but also in previous studies, like this study by Hanley and colleagues in 2003. They conducted the restricted reinforcement assessment as baseline to assess the need for intervention for 7 participants, and they found 5 of the 7 participants meeting criteria to join the study. So what that means is they did not have, they showed limited interest or limited engagement in leisure items. And the treatment that they implemented in this study to increase engagement in leisure items is either a DRA intervention or an NCR intervention. So the NCR intervention is where they just delivered an edible for a fixed time interval. So as the kid is playing with the item, they just gave edibles. And they observed that there is an increased engagement rate with less preferred activities for all participants. However, there were some limitations to this study, such as they did not conduct the RR assessment after treatment, so they weren't able to compare how engagement levels changed after treatment versus before treatment. And because they only implemented either DRA or NCR for one particular individual, it isn't clear about the effects of each treatment. So what happened here in this study, Dr. Roscoe is extending previous research on increasing leisure item engagement. But they're doing it in a little bit of a different way, which we will be talking about later. Specifically, instead of like the Hanley study, where they only did 1 intervention per client, this study is gonna do a progressive treatment approach. So what they're gonna do is they're gonna introduce prompting, which is 1 treatment, and then if that is not enough for a participant to meet criteria for sufficient engagement, they will add another component to the treatment and then see if that combination will produce enough engagement that meets their criteria. So for this study in particular, the goal is to increase functional engagement with multiple leisure items when iPad was not available. So a little background on our participants. In this study, there are 5 different participants. We have Sam, Emily, Aaron, George, and John. If you see their ages, they're like teens. Sam, Emily is 18 years old, so they're an adult, I guess, like from their age. Aaron is 17, George is 13, and John is 14. All of them are diagnosed with ASD, except for Sam, who has a comorbidity of ADHD, and then Aaron has Landau-Kleffner syndrome. The rest only has ASD as a diagnosis. And here we see Sam is the only participant who communicates vocally. He communicates in complete sentences, whereas the rest of the participants communicate using AAC, majority of them. So Emily, Aaron, George, and John uses AAC, and they use 1 to 3 word commands to communicate. For all of them, the concerns are pretty similar. So they're, according to their caregivers, their interest majority is just iPad time. They just engage in iPad. And I think for the caregivers, it is a concern because of, like I said just now, like different scenarios where the iPad might not be available. If the iPad isn't available, does that mean they don't have any leisure activities that they can engage in? Because the iPad, it depends on a lot of things, right? Like Wi-Fi connection, battery, and then if, knock on wood, one of them breaks the iPad, then that iPad isn't available. And we all know fixing an iPad can take days, right? So I think for the treatment team, it was important for them to be able to introduce other leisure activities to these individuals. So that's why they were picked to join the study. Okay. So prior to the assessment, which is the RR assessment, for these participants, the researchers conducted an indirect assessment. So they interviewed caregivers who spent around 8 hours a day engaging with these students, right? And the objective of the indirect assessment is just to find out if the clients or the students actually engage in limited leisure item engagement. And the researchers also wanted to know like what items do they engage in like high rates. So the goal is for them to identify 5 additional leisure items on top of the iPad. So a total of 6 items in total. So this is the questionnaire that they used. This is the indirect assessment that they used to assess the caregivers, which I think is really cool for them to like include so that we can read together. So I'm just gonna show this here. So it asks like, oh, which item do you want them to engage in less? And then please specify how much do they engage in these items. And then they also ask which leisure items do you want the clients to engage in more, or which leisure items do you think is beneficial for these items? And then they also ask about like if they engage functionally or not, or if it's just like functional engagement. They ask you to like list an order of priority of the different leisure items that the caregiver listed. And then they give different scenarios and ask like, oh, what would the participant do if the items noted above were presented at the same time with the restricted interest item? So for example, iPad. So what do you think that the participant will do if the participant has iPad and then puzzle, Lego, stickers in front of them? Would they just stick with the iPad, or would they show interest in other items too? So they ask those kinds of questions. Okay. So after the interview, the team was able to identify these items for each of the participants. So what's really interesting here is the items for these 5 participants are like pretty similar. So like Legos, puzzle blocks, Magna Doodle coloring book. This one is also like stickers, Legos, puzzles, books, right? It's pretty similar across all 5 participants, which is like super interesting to me because so when I was reading this article, I might be wrong, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, but the paper was Dr. Roscoe practices in Western New England University, which is under New England Center for Children. So I'm guessing that these participants go to NEC as their school because the leisure items that are being introduced to the students are pretty similar, like with all the students. And when I was working there, these were the items we were teaching, like the leisure skills. activity, like the leisure programs were these items. And then I would also like sometimes think like, is this really fun for them? Like they're like 18-year-old, and then we're teaching them how to do Legos, and we're teaching them how to do like scratching pads and stickers, things like that. So I do appreciate the study, but I also like Tanti said just now, like teens a lot of times they just, if they're not taught a lot of leisure skills when they're kids, they just go to community outings as leisure skills, right? Like I don't know, even if we see an increase in engagement, I don't know if they're enjoying it. Does that make sense? So I would love to know like the definition, their definition of like leisure. How would you define leisure for this study in particular? Is it just like engagement, so they can do like independent play, or is it like leisure as in they have to be enjoying it? But that's besides the point, right? So these are the items that they used in this study. Because one of the treatments in this study is a DRA, they did a paired stimulus preference assessment to identify what reinforcers to use for each participant. And they missed Aaron. His results were not in the paper, but they included results for the other four. And they also conducted a pre-assessment exposure for some of the participants if they did not demonstrate functional engagement using the item during baseline condition, which is the RR assessment, or during one of the prompting conditions, which is one of the treatment conditions that we will be talking about later. So the goal of this pre-assessment exposure is just to teach the participant on how to engage with the item functionally. So in case the researchers or whoever is conducting the assessment or research does not observe functional play skills for a specific item with a specific person, they would teach how to engage with it properly first. And if the student engages functionally once, then they would move on to the next item, or they would stop. So the criteria is just one time showing that they can engage functionally with the item. So like I said just now, this study, similar to the Hanley study we talked about in the introduction, uses the RR assessment to take baseline data to identify like how much is the client or the participant actually engaging with each item. So they use this assessment. And it also confirms the indirect assessment results that we got from the previous caregivers. Oh, and the RR assessment, you'll see later, but it's done before, during, and after the leisure item training. So there's two dependent variables for this study. The first one is simple engagement, which is defined as hand-to-item contact in the absence of stereotypy. Example, tapping of fingers on the item or tapping the item to a surface, placing the item against the mouth, spinning or rolling the item, or moving the item back and forth repeatedly. So simple engagement. And also functional engagement. So this is how Roscoe and colleagues expanded previous studies too. Previous studies, I don't think they were focusing on functional engagement, on teaching functional engagement, but this study, they expanded and focused on teaching functional engagement also. So for each of the items identified for the participants, they had a definition of what functional engagement is. So for example, Legos would be stacking Legos on top of each other. Puzzles would be putting puzzle pieces together, and so on. The sessions, so like the assessment itself and the treatment sessions later and the post-treatment assessment are all conducted in the participants' classroom or residences, or in a 3x3 research room. So it's pretty controlled area. So not like natural setting, like in the living room or like in the car, things like that. So it's pretty controlled. So that's something to note also. So for our measurement, for the training, for the treatment conditions and also the assessment, oops, that's not supposed to be there. Let's skip that first. Sorry. Let me talk about the procedure of the assessment first. So like I said, each assessment was conducted 3 times. One session is 3 minutes long. There were 7 items presented in an array. So the 5 items identified via the indirect assessment, the iPad, which is the one that's the restricted item. So the item that all the participants wanted to engage in, and also a control item, which is just a piece of white paper. The setup is the teacher and participant sat across each other, and then the teacher in beginning of the session would say, you can play with what you want. If you want to, you can play. And then the participants are free to engage in multiple items simultaneously or one at a time. So it's shown all at the same time. So the participant can do whatever they want. And criteria for item restriction is engagement of at least 60% of the session. So meaning item restriction just means that the participant is engaging with that item enough. So like the iPad, they're engaging with that item enough. And if they meet this criteria, it's going to be taken from the array. So if this criteria is met, item was removed. So how do we calculate engagement? Engagement is calculated with this momentary time sampling, right? Of 10 seconds each. So they calculated. So again, there's 2 variables, right? Simple engagement and functional engagement. For simple engagement, they took data. So the moment of observation is the last 2 seconds of the 10 seconds. So like second 1 to 8, you would just observe, and then second 9 and 10, that's when you take the data, whether they're engaging or not. So just the last 2 seconds is your observation period. For functional engagement, because it is like a more complex interaction between the participant and the item itself, they chose to have a longer observation moment, which lasted for 5 seconds. Okay. And then, like I said, that's how they got the percentages right here. That's how they got the engagement percentages for all these sessions they're conducting. So this is the criteria to terminate the RR assessment. So when would they stop conducting the assessment? If participant met criteria for restriction for all items, meaning if the participant engaged in every item, so all the 7 items for 60% or more, they would stop the assessment. If there were 2 consecutive sessions with no engagement with any item, meaning they did not engage in even the iPad, they would stop. If there were 3 consecutive sessions with less than 60% engagement for all items, meaning if they engage in less than 60% of all the items combined. So not just for one item, but all the items. And then if 20 sessions have been conducted. Okay, so for the treatment itself, so after they done the assessment, this is where they go into treatment, right? So from the assessment, they see, okay, each participant, they're not engaging in anything else aside from the iPad. We want to increase engagement in other items aside from the iPad, right? So they go to training, right? This is the treatment part. Again, training was conducted on items that were reported to be most beneficial according to the indirect assessment. So out of the 5 items, some of the items remained in baseline, meaning not all items were treated on. So not all items got training. Okay. For Sam and Emily, 2 of the 5 items got removed because there wasn't any functional, they couldn't define like functional engagement with that item. Specifically, those 2 items are like coloring and like sketching, because they couldn't like define it. So they just got rid of it. So Sam and Emily had less items than Aaron, George, and John. All right, so these are our conditions for the treatment, right? There's baseline, there's treatment 1, prompting, and then treatment 2, prompting plus DRA. And they use a concurrent multiple baseline design. And how they set up the session is they conducted it in a 2-to-1 ratio. So this is what it looks like. Let me just. So let me just take Sam as an example, okay? So let's pretend there's Sam, and then we are treating Lego, puzzle, and block, and Magna Doodle and coloring book, they're on baseline. For example, right? So I would do Lego, puzzle, block, baseline. Right? So 2-to-1 ratio. So each of the item being taught would be presented 2 times before like 1 baseline was presented. 1 training session is 3 minutes, and the same, they were told you can play if you want in the beginning of each session. So I want us to look at this for a moment. This is a flowchart of everything that's happening in the study. So there's a lot of components in the study. So I think if we look at this together, it'll make a little bit more sense. So first, we do the pre-training RR assessment, which is the baseline, right? To figure out if the items actually need intervention on, right? And then after that, you do leisure item training for simple engagement. So remember, simple engagement is just them interacting with the item. It doesn't have to be functional. As long as they're not stimming and they're just interacting, that would be counted. So they did simple engagement first. After they met criteria for simple engagement, they moved on to functional engagement, where the participants had to actually play properly. So the ones that had the definitions just now. After that, they did post-training RR assessment. So remember, the Henley study, they only did RR assessment in the beginning, but Roscoe and colleagues said, I'm going to do it in the beginning and the end. So this is them. So we will be able to see like the comparison before and after. So after the post-training RR assessment, the third criterion is sufficient engagement with previously trained item during post-training RR assessment. So if they showed sufficient performance in this post-training, they were good, they're done, they passed. Okay, so these conditions, this happened twice for the simple engagement and also the functional engagement. Okay, all right. And these are the outcome requirements for moving on from this criteria to this criteria. Okay, so to pass criteria 1, 80% of simple engagement with target item for 3 consecutive 3-minute leisure item training sessions. And then if they pass that, they move on to functional engagement. And if they pass 80% functional engagement for 3 consecutive sessions, and then they also pass 80%, 3 consecutive 10-minute 80% engagement in 10-minute sessions, they would pass. and go to post-training RR, they would assess it again to see like the differences. Okay. And then we'll talk about this later. They had a component for like retraining. So what if they failed in the post-treatment assessment? So they added like a post-training thing also later that we're gonna look at. So what the baseline condition look like is literally you just give the item to the participant and say, you can play it if you want. And then you just observe for 3 minutes. For prompting, simple engagement condition. So this is treatment 1, prompting for simple engagement only. Similarly, you start with saying you can play with it if you want. And then in the middle of each 10-second interval, so like at 5 seconds, at 15 seconds, at 25 seconds, the researcher would, or the research assistant would say, play with block, play with sticker. So just vocal prompt. And if the participant showed no response following the prompt, then they will not repeat the prompt until the next middle of 10 seconds. So if at 5 seconds they don't respond to the prompt, there's not going to be another prompt between 5 seconds and 15 seconds. The next prompt is still going to be at 15 seconds. Okay? But if the participant presented with simple engagement, they were doing simple engagement independently, no vocal prompt was given. They just let them be. If the participant did not produce 3 consecutive sessions of 80% or more, then they would move on to prompting plus DRA. So move on to the next treatment. It's the same. The difference is they just presented a preferred edible contingent on 5 seconds of simple engagement. So there's like the reinforcer aspect to it, different from just the prompting one. So at this point, say the participant has passed simple engagement criteria. So we move on to the functional engagement. We move on to functional engagement, and the difference between simple engagement and functional engagement is just the prompt given, actually. So it's still given at the, sorry, backtrack. So if no functional engagement is observed during the first 5 seconds of a 10-second interval, the prompt that is given is a vocal plus model prompt. Okay, different from the simple engagement one. The simple engagement one, it was just vocal prompt. Now it's vocal plus model prompt. So it's literally just while showing, put the block on top of the block, put the block on top of the block, like that. If they observe functional engagement in the first 5 seconds of the 10-second interval, then they don't give any prompts. Same, there's a criteria if it did not produce at least 3 consecutive sessions, then you moved on to prompting plus DRA. So whereas the simple engagement, they gave edible every 5 seconds of engagement, for functional engagement, they felt that it was a little bit tedious to do it based on time. So they did it based on a predetermined number of occurrence. So they did it based on frequency. So how many times they put on a sticker, how many times they stacked a single piece of block. So how did they determine this, like the schedule? So they based it on the average frequency of engagement in previous conditions for each item. So after passing the functional engagement, they moved on to post-training RR assessment. The objective of this post-training RR assessment is to assess generality and also to assess maintenance, just to see like after the training ends, will this engagement still persist, essentially? So will we still see engagement after the training is stopped? And also, because how the training is done, it's similar to a single stimulus preference assessment. So like they're showing block one at a time, puzzle one at a time, sticker one at a time, versus in the RR assessment, they're showing everything at the same time. So it's different. So they want to see if it generalizes or not. Okay. Oops. Okay. So this is the remediation. So remediation was prescribed if at least 60% functional engagement for the most recently trained item was not observed. So if during the RR assessment, we observe less than 60% of functional engagement, they would redo the training. So they would see which training was most effective for this client, for this item. They would redo it during RR assessment until the restriction criteria was met. And the restriction criteria is 60% functional engagement. Okay. If after this training they pass, then they finish. They're done. Sorry. After they do the training, they do like another RR without the training. And if they pass that, it's done. But if they fail the test at the end without the training, they get booster training sessions. So they redo the training sessions again, like the training conditions again. And then they do another RR to test if they passed or not. Ooh, okay. Let's see. So before I go to results, are there any questions on the procedures of this study? Okay, cool. Let me know if there's questions, because I was definitely like confused when I was first reading it, because there's just so many components. So just let me know. All right, so let's look at our first result. So this is Sam. For Sam, Legos and puzzles are the two items that they trained. So these two items, Sam received prompt and prompt plus DRA. And then blocks were his control item, right? So here we can see during baseline, let me orient you to this first. You see the black dot? The black dot is simple engagement and the white dot is functional engagement, okay? So it's gonna be the same for all the charts. So we see in baseline engagement levels are pretty low for both simple engagement and functional engagement for both Legos and puzzles. After the prompt treatment for simple engagement, we see simple engagement increasing, eventually meeting criteria to move on to functional engagement. So the reason why we're not doing prompt plus DRA for simple engagement is because they already met the criteria with just the prompt. Because one of the goals is to like identify what is the least restrictive intervention, right? So that's why they're doing this. So yeah, so here we see prompt for functional engagement. They did not meet like decreasing trend, so they did the prompt functional engagement plus DRA, and then eventually here you see the meeting criteria at the end over here. If you look at here, you see here, remember I said for functional engagement, they were providing reinforcer for responses instead of time, right? So the schedule of reinforcement here is an FR1. So every time Sam stacked one Lego, he got a reinforcer. Meaning every time he put a Lego, they gave him an edible. But what they found is Sam got very distracted by the edible. So in here, they changed it to an FR10. Because I guess they didn't want to, because he needed his hands to like stack the blocks and everything. And it was interesting because they observed this despite the fact that they were like feeding him the edibles and not like giving him it to his hand. So yeah, that's something interesting to note. And then eventually here he meets criteria. Same with the puzzles, right? And then the blocks is the one item that did not receive intervention. Although there is like an increased rate of engagement without intervention, it wasn't enough to meet like the criteria that they had. So further training was needed for this one. Okay. Okay. I can't move the slide. Okay, so this is like the before after, right? The before after of the RR. Here we see two graphs, bar graphs. Oh, okay. Here we see two bar graphs. The one on the left depicts the results for pre-training, and the one on the right is post-training. So the bar graph shows the mean rank order of restriction. Okay, so the order, the order itself. Here we see iPad during pre-training is number 1. Here, after post-training, iPad stayed at number 1, but we see that Legos, there's like engagement compared to like pre-training. So there is learning happening, right? For Sam here. Here also we see puzzles increasing here. So the asterisk here just shows 60% of engagement was observed for that item in particular. And the restriction criteria is 60%. So for Sam, Legos and puzzles met this criteria. So it just shows, oh, now Sam can engage in Legos and puzzles in addition to iPad. And then we have Emily. Similarly, she goes through baseline where her engagements are pretty low too. And then after prompt for simple engagement, she met criteria to move on to functional engagement for the items here. And then she moved on to functional engagement plus DRA because the prompt only treatment for functional engagement was not enough for Emily for stickers. And then here we also see like puzzles, which is the item that was not trained. We see like increased engagement. However, it wasn't enough for the criteria. So additional training was needed. So here we see previous RR assessment. She just engaged in iPad. And then after, she also engaged in sticker. So she met criteria for sticker, and she also met criteria for Legos, which are the 2 items that she received training in. Then we have Aaron, who has more items. So he got trained on Legos, beads, and puzzles. Low engagement in baseline. Only needed prompt treatment to simply engage with the item. And then prompt treatment to meet criteria for functional engagement with the item. So here we see Pre-training, he was only engaging in iPad, and then post-training, he met criteria for iPad, Legos, beats, puzzles. Yeah. So there is like improvement, but what we see from the results is that for each item, the treatment is different, and across each participant, the treatment is different also. So I think it's hard to identify like, oh, this particular treatment combination works, and this is what we should all be using for all clients and all items. And it just shows that we have to, again, cater for each client and just try one by one. Here we see that George also shows low levels of engagement in baseline, and then increased simple engagement using the prompt treatment, and then he showed, ooh, no. So George actually needed booster trainings because he didn't pass the RR assessment, the post-treatment RR assessment right here. Ooh. Okay, give me a second. George. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so following the completion of leisure item training with Legos, criterion performance for item restriction of Legos. So George did not meet 60% or higher functional engagement. So they did the remediation strategy and the booster training. And after that, then we see the engagement levels being at the levels that the researchers wanted. So for George specifically, they needed additional training. So here we see for Legos itself, George needed these interventions. For blocks, he needed these interventions, and stickers, he needed these interventions. But we do see there is an increase in engagement for items that he was not previously engaging in. For John, let's just look at this one. For Legos, he needed prompting treatment for simple engagement, and then prompting treatment plus DRA for functional engagement. And he needed more training in the RR assessment that was conducted post-training for Legos. And for puzzles, he needed prompting for simple engagement plus DRA, but he didn't need like the extra training like he did in Legos. Same with stickers, he didn't need the extra training that he needed in Legos. So in summary, the treatment approach in the study showed increasing functional leisure skills for all the participants. However, the treatment components needed to achieve this varied across participants and also varied across the items. So if you see here, like even here in George, he needed booster training for stickers, but not for Legos and blocks. For Aaron, like he needed embedded training in his RR assessment plus booster training for Legos, but not in beads and puzzles. So it's different for each of them. Oof. Oh no. Okay. Give me a second. I have one more slide. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so the progressive treatment approach was effective, right? So one of the things that Roscoe and colleagues wanted to do is to implement the least amount of treatment, right? So the least restrictive amount of treatment. So that's why they introduced one treatment component at a time. So although it was effective, it did take a lot of time. It did take a lot of sessions. So a question is, if we would consider like just doing the prompting plus DRA from the beginning and then taking away components instead, would that be faster way of teaching, right? Will it take less sessions? And another interesting thing is, if you guys see in the results, although we see there is increased engagement in the other items, they were still engaging with the iPad. And if you really see the results, iPad was number one for most still. See, it's like the bar graph still like more than the other items, despite there being more engagement compared to like post pre-test. Oh, pre-intervention. So how do you think we might facilitate the shift in response allocation? Because I have clients who, with parents coming in and say like, my child just plays with the iPad and I want him not to play with the iPad anymore. So they want the iPad to be taken away completely. Or how can we, or like how do we, I guess the question is it possible for us to, for the participant to choose something else aside from the iPad, even though it's available? I know it's like back to preferences, but yeah, I feel like a lot of parents just like, I want my kid to stop playing with the iPad. Let's make him like books more or something else more. And a lot of times it's still very hard to do despite having done like leisure training and all that. And the participants in the study does not engage in problem behavior related to restricted access to items or activities. And I just am not sure how this would go with clients that have challenging behaviors related to that. Any thoughts? Because I personally find that my clients that I find hardest teaching leisure skills for are clients that have trouble with restricted access to items or activities. Like they would engage in severe problem behavior if I restricted items or activities. One of the things I've been trying to do is like pairing, so they could watch the iPad while trying out different leisure activities. It's a hit or miss for me. So if you guys have any other suggestions, that would be great, or experience, would love to hear.